8 years ago, Washington voters wanted to have the option of buying alcohol at grocery stores, so they passed an initiative to make it happen.
So now big box stores like Costco sell liquor. So are we better off? KREM 2's Casey Decker looked into it.
There are so many ways to answer that question. Are we better off? I decided to focus on 3 of them, the ones that most reflect how the law has impacted day-to-day life. 1, prices. 2, selection. And 3, tax revenue for the state. We also want to hear from you. What is most important to you when buying alcohol? You can join the conversation using the Vote Now tab on the KREM 2 mobile app.
The deceptive ads against 1183 make claims about taxes that have been deemed false by Washington's Attorney General.
Back in 2011, Costco broke records by spending more than $20 million pushing Initiative 1183. They made a lot of promises.
That will provide more funds for vital public services without raising taxes and bring more competitive prices to consumers.
But did those promises bear out? We looked into the data. Washington keeps stats on the average price for a liter of booze, including tax. And since the switch in 2012, prices have gone up by nearly 20%. But that's not adjusted for inflation. If you make that adjustment, it's still an increase, though just under 8%. So, on average at least, on prices, we're not better off. Costco said they had no comment for this story. So we took a trip down the street to Murrows, where we talked with store manager Harry Wilson.
Well, the pricing is competitive.
He knows that prices on average have gone up, but also that averages don't tell the full story.
From what I hear from customers, because of the amount of taxes that they're charging, it's a little bit more expensive now to buy it in the store.
Do you think that having multiple places selling at different prices can result in some liquors being cheaper?
Yeah, some liquors are. There's no doubt about it. So it just depends on which venue you're talking about and what their profit margins are.
More options also means big stores can buy in bulk and get better deals they can pass on to consumers. But not all liquor sellers are a fan of those bulk deals.
Now, the law says that stores have to be at least 10,000 square feet in order to sell liquor. But there is an exception. Buildings that used to house state liquor stores were auctioned off, and many of them became private liquor stores, like this one.
I've owned this store for 6.5 years since the privatization took over.
Eggers South Hill Liquor is one of just 2 such stores still in business in Spokane County.
Myself and Medical Lake.
Smaller stores can't buy in bulk the way big boxes can.
How do you compete with the big box stores?
I can't compete with the big box stores. One, the big box stores have huge buying power.
The only way they get by is through taking smaller margins.
Yeah, if I wanted to run on a huge, higher profit margin, I would be so priced out.
And by developing a loyal clientele. They do that through promotions, special orders, and above all else, selection.
If they're looking for something and we can find it, we bring it in for them. You won't find that at the big box stores or the grocery stores.
And that brings us to our second metric. Do customers really have more options now than they used to?
This one's a little trickier to analyze. There's not a lot of hard data out there, but we can take a sort of unscientific approach by just kind of going around to stores and seeing how many varieties of, say, bourbon they have.
Eggers, for instance, had 51 varieties. The Walmart location I stopped at had 12. Same goes for Target. This Rosars had 13, 15 at Trader Joe's, 17 at Winco, 19 at Rite Aid. Fred Meyer had 27 kinds of bourbon, 31 at Safeway, and 33 at Albertsons. And naturally, Total Wine blows them all away. I counted 168 varieties of bourbon. And for comparison, the Idaho state-run liquor store I stopped through in Post Falls had 76 kinds of bourbon. So, are we better off when it comes to selection? That sort of depends on where you live. If you're close to a specialty store like Eggers or Total Wine, you're probably pretty pleased with your options. But if you're reliant on grocery stores, you might have fewer choices than you used to when the state ran things. Then again, you also might not care. Lots of customers aren't looking for rare liquors and they prefer the convenience of the grocery store.
Not a lot of profit. What it's about convenience for the customer. It's here for that person that doesn't want to have to drive all over and hunt up something.
Okay, that brings us to our final metric, tax revenue. Costco and friends promised millions in new dollars for state programs. So, did that happen? Well, that's a tough question to answer. Here's why. When liquor was state-run, revenue came from taxes and liquor sales. Now, revenue comes from taxes and liquor fees. And they're collected by different agencies. To make matters worse, one of those agencies also collects marijuana taxes, and the data gets a bit jumbled up. So it's hard to isolate liquor-specific profits. But doing the best we can, here's what we came up with. This graph shows a sharp drop-off in liquor profits immediately after privatization. They appear to be on the way back up, but it's still not where it used to be. Basically, tax revenue has gone up over the past decade, but not by enough to offset the lost revenue from selling booze outright. So, private liquor, are we better off? On price, not on average, though there are exceptions since you can shop around. On selection, you've normally got fewer brands, but more locations. And on tax revenue, it's hard to isolate, but generally it appears we aren't better off.
Now, guys, one more thing I'll throw in there because I know this was a big concern during the 2011 election, public health. Now, this is just one metric, but CDC data shows alcohol consumption and binge drinking rates, both in Washington and the Spokane area, have basically stayed the same since liquor went private. If anything, they've gone slightly down. That also plays into an interesting fact I learned from a liquor trade group. In Washington, liquor sales are up, and it's cutting into wine and beer sales. So rather than just drinking more overall, people are just involving hard liquor more often in their drinking habits now that it's easier to get.
It certainly is interesting to
It
kind of
is.
analyze all those different metrics when you break it down. I think for a lot of people, convenience is the big one, right?
Exactly. I mean, even if all those other things seem like we might be worse off, a lot of people say, well, it's worth it for the convenience to be able to buy it when I'm buying all my other groceries.
And I, for one, didn't know there were 168 different bourbons.
I didn't either until I went in there.
Just learned that.
Yeah.
The more you know. Okay,
Impressive
thank you,
selection there.
Casey. Great stuff.
Well, it's incredibly rare, guys, and here's a good metric of it. I talked with our sales director here at Creme, and she said in 20 years, with just one exception, no presidential candidate has ever purchased ads in Spokane. That exception when Bernie Sanders visited Spokane in 2016. For that, he bought some spots advertising his rally. Outside of that, Bloomberg is a first. Some fast facts for you. He's dropped roughly $200,000 on ads in Spokane and about $40 million nationwide. He's in all 50 states and nearly 100 markets. Our sales director said that's unheard of. So why is Bloomberg breaking precedent and buying ads in Spokane? A few reasons. One, he can. According to Forbes, Michael Bloomberg is the 9th richest person in the world, worth well over $50 billion. He can afford to drop a few tens of millions on his campaign. Two, he sort of has to. He's entering this race very late. Considering that, his current 4% polling average is pretty impressive. He trails only 4 candidates nationally. But those candidates have established voting blocks and messaging. Bloomberg still needs to get his message out. Ads are, of course, a way to do that. He also knows he probably won't win the early state, so he's focusing his money basically everywhere else. And 3, Spokane matters more now than it ever has before. 2 big changes came to Washington this year. 1, Democrats will use a balloted primary rather than an in-person caucus. 2, that primary will happen much earlier than it has in the past. Rather than in late May when the nominations are normally wrapped up, it'll be March 10th. Idaho's will be on the same day. That means the inland Northwest could become a crucial battleground, seeing more ads in the future and even candidate visits. Now, since you're already likely seeing this Bloomberg ad, we also wanted to give a couple points a quick fact check.
In the shadow of 9/11, Mike is elected mayor of a shaken city. He rebuilds, creating 400,000 new jobs.
The facts support that claim. The total number of jobs in New York did increase by about that much during his tenure. But the unemployment rate actually went up by more than 3%. Of course, a lot of that had to do with the effects of the global recession.
And raising teacher pay and graduation rates.
Graduation rates are pretty easy to verify, and that claim checks out. Barely half of high schoolers graduated when Bloomberg first took office. That figure was more like 3/4 after he left. Teacher pay is mostly true. When he first took office, he reached an agreement with teachers that significantly increased salaries. But later in his tenure, following the recession, he often fought with teachers' unions who wanted more reliable raises. One other thing. Those ads, of course, omit some of Bloomberg's biggest controversies as mayor. Now, those include the stop and frisk policy, which disproportionately affected people of color, and that's something he's recently apologized for. Anyway, although this is among the first presidential candidate ads Spokane has ever seen, it's unlikely to be the last, unless one of the Democrats wraps up the nomination very soon. Casey Decker, KREM 2 News. This one is a question we get all the time. Calls, emails, Facebook messages, tweets. Are other cities giving homeless people bus tickets to Spokane? It's a common talking point in our broader conversation about homelessness. So, is it true? Is that really happening? To find out, we talked to people working with the homeless in Portland, Seattle, and Spokane. Here's what we learned. In Portland, a busing program exists. It's called Ticket Home, and every year they give out a few hundred bus, train, or plane tickets to homeless people. In order to get a ticket, people have to prove they'll have a place to live in their new city. Although, as an investigation by our sister station in Portland found, they often end up back on the streets anyway. Regardless, of the hundreds of tickets given out in Portland, only 3 were for Spokane. Multnomah County says 1 Spokane ticket was given out in 2016, 17, and 18, and 0 in 2019. In Seattle, many of the homelessness services are run by the Compass Housing Alliance. They too have a ticket program. They told us, quote, "On occasion, should we have the funding available, we can offer a bus ticket to someone who is reconnecting with family who can help support them, or an offer for employment." But they didn't have numbers on how many tickets they've provided or whether any were to Spokane. Now, obviously, there are more cities than just Portland and Seattle, but a lengthy investigation by The Guardian estimates that over the last decade, only about 50 people got bus tickets to Spokane. Meanwhile, Spokane's own point-in-time count shows that the vast majority of people on the streets here are from here. And Catholic Charities Eastern Washington tells us 80 to 85% of the people they serve are from within 75 miles of Spokane. So, are cities giving homeless people bus tickets to Spokane? Yes, that we can verify. But are the recipients of those tickets a significant portion of our city's homeless? No, they're not. For KREM 2 News, I'm Casey Decker.